Bad news from the US government on the first quarter. According to the latest estimates from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, GDP was even weaker than first thought. The initial estimate was for 1.6%, which was the lowest growth rate in 2 years. Now they're saying 1.3%. That big 5% quarter from last year seems like a distant memory, and more it's proving to have been a government fueled aberration. So now that GDP is sliding in the direction of a lot more economic data, it raises a whole bunch of very sticky questions. And I don't mean consumer prices and inflation. Starting with, is this slowdown itself going to slow down? Because we get all sorts of corporate reports as well as a lot of other data that suggests that maybe it's not. And when you don't have GDP in your corner, suddenly the overall picture of the economic data and its potential in the short run changes dramatically. And we have to worry about something else too. How is this GDP number being considered at the Federal Reserve? Because up until now, at least over the last little while, it's been inflation, 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 sticky CPIs. We don't see enough progress. We're not confident enough. Oh, crap, GDP just got really weak. So here's a question for you, Mr. Van Meter. Steve, do you think this GDP report has made a difference in the economic thinking for policymakers at the Federal Reserve? Because the initial statements that we got here suggest that maybe there's some thinking that we might need to stop talking about consumer prices and start talking more about the softening in the US economy.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. I mean, we have to understand the perspective of the Fed comes from one person and not so much the other members, but it's what Fed Chair Jerome Powell wants. If he's suggesting that rate cuts are going to be toward the end of the fourth quarter, that's the party line. And we're going to hear all of the members kind of suggest that. But what we started to hear a little bit today from this week was from Bostic, who started to say that, well, wait a minute, he's starting to lean like, hey, we're coming right into target range, but I'm still sticking to that fourth quarter because he doesn't want to get into trouble. But he's trying to suggest to people that maybe it's time for the Fed to change their perspective a little bit because the risk that they face, and this happens every cycle, they think they've got it, they know they're going to hit their targets, and the next thing you know, they overshoot it to the downside. The floor just drops out from the economy. And part of them are afraid that this is going to happen again. And that's what we're starting to see from the Federal Reserve now, at least from some of the members. They're waffling a little bit, is because they know that perhaps this trend is not going to stop.
Yeah, wasn't it? We talked about Bostic last week in our conversation, where he said he basically admitted their data dependence is whatever the latest CPI is, right? Remember, as the numbers come out, we're looking at them and see if they fit our expectations. But if I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but if I remember, Bostic in April was saying I might be ready for a rate hike if consumer prices continue. The usual hedging language and everything they throw in with that. Last month he was saying I was ready for a rate hike, and then just was it yesterday he said, "Oh yeah, fourth quarter, if not sooner." If I got that right?
Yeah, you do. And you start to think about this, Jeff, is the Fed has been talking about how there's be a second half rebound. Well, here we are almost at the second half. And what are we seeing from different retailers and wholesalers, and all of the data is that there's no real sign of things stopping. The deceleration, it depends on where you're standing. Some are experiencing a larger one than others, but there's no sign of no data that suggests that, hey, everything's stabilized now, and foot traffic is finally at a normal level, or sales are starting to bottom out. It's still the direction that things are looking weaker. And of course, as you and I know, that eventually hits the labor market. And that's the one thing the Fed is not prepared for, is to see unemployment claims start to head higher. The official data says so far everything looks okay, but as you and I know, that can change in a moment.
Yeah, labor market is important in a number of ways, but for the Federal Reserve, for them, they look at consumer price pressures as a product of the Phillips curve, and so tight labor market and all that stuff factors into their fears over consumer price pressures, and so they're definitely keeping an eye on the labor market. So I wonder, the Beige book came out this past week, and it referred to labor market conditions that don't sound all that much tight or Phillips curvy. Let me read a passage from the Beige book. This is the overall national summary. Employment rose at a slight pace overall. 8 districts reported negligible to modest job gains. And I love how they lump those in together. Negligible or modest job gains in 8 of the 12 districts. And the remaining 4 districts reported no changes in employment. That doesn't sound like a robust labor market. And they continue. Multiple districts said employee turnover has decreased, which we see in the quits data for JOLTS. And one noted that employers' bargaining power has increased as employees are more afraid of their jobs. They now have to listen to employers dictate all the terms. Hiring plans were mixed. A couple districts expect a continuation of modest job gains, while others noted a pullback in hiring expectations amid weaker business demand and reluctance due to the uncertain economic environment. There's that term. It's always uncertain economic environment or uncertain consumer climate. But the upshot here is the Fed, in its Beige book, which is a selected, curated number of its own anecdotes that it pulls together from its own districts, sounds a lot like other weak data that we continue to talk about. It doesn't sound anything like the strong, sticky CPI Phillips curve type of behavior that that Jay Powell in particular keeps harping on. So you have to, is there something else happening behind the scenes with the Fed where they see this weakness? They're actually writing about it. They're talking about it. Bostic, as you said, looks like he's changing his tune. Is the tide shifting away from sticky CPIs to holy crap, what's going on in the economy?
Yeah, I actually think so, Jeff, because we've been hearing that finally U.S. consumers are getting ahead of inflation, but then we look at, again, we come back to McDonald's and Burger King and all the Walmarts, and we look at all this data and we say, wait a minute, the retailers are not suggesting that that's exactly correct. And also in the Beige book, they noted that average hourly earnings were headed back toward pre-pandemic levels. Now, if that's the case, and we know that that is likely true, then that means U.S. consumers are running into a problem where prices still aren't coming down. Of course, we know that insurance costs don't get factored that much into the CPI, and that's been a huge hit on budgets. But what this suggests is, once again, consumer prices are going to be higher than wage growth. That is every reason for the Fed to be concerned, because there's one, very specific word that's been showing up in earnings report after earnings report from all of these retailers, and that is the word discretionary. And in what they're using it, Jeff, is to say discretionary spending is going down. That's a problem. The Fed knows it.
That's what we keep coming back to over and over again. You and I, we talk about this all the time. We talk about it really throughout the process here. It's about jobs, but it's not really about jobs. It's about income. And income's never really caught up to price changes. They never got, I mean, for a while there, it looked like they were catching up when prices started to decelerate and incomes were growing at a relatively stable pace. And it looked like, okay, they're going to converge and then wages are going to be better than prices and everything would be happy and hunky dory. And I think a lot of the soft landing was predicated on that point where wages would be better than prices and consumers would therefore actually be better off. And we could go on from there. But I think that was overly positive and optimistic to begin with, because the gap wasn't like this. The gap was enormous. And at some point last year, the labor market actually did slow down. And so what looked like wages catching up from way far behind actually started to slow down and turn the other way without ever coming close to catching up. But think about that from the perspective of consumers and then businesses that service consumers. Consumers were, okay, I'm a little bit optimistic. I think things are starting to move in my direction. Oh crap, they're not. So consumers are saying, it was looking positive, but now it's not looking positive. I'm going to start making adjustments. And as you just said, Steve, where do you make adjustments? You make adjustments in your discretionary spending. And that's the message that gets reinforced over and over again. But it's not just companies citing these idle factors. They're saying this for a reason. And consumers are cutting back on discretionary spending for a reason. It's not just gasoline prices. It goes back to insufficient incomes.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And we see that in the regional Fed surveys, which is baffling to me of why this doesn't show up in the Beige book at all. They kind of mentioned, okay, there's a little bit of hiring here and there and a little bit of slowdown in wage growth, but they didn't mention that hours work continues to get cut. And that's a kind of a recurring theme even in the Fed surveys of the manufacturing sector, and even now somewhat in the services sector, is hours are getting trimmed a little. And really, you think about, okay, well, what's a half hour or maybe an hour? Well, that could be the difference for one employee taking their family out and spending some money on the discretionary side of the economy. So it's a huge factor here. And on top of that, we know that backlogs continue to get worked down, which only makes me wonder how big the backlog orders must be, because we've gone on this just impressive run of just clearing them down. And it just makes me, is there going to be a month where their report's going to be like, hey, we're out of backlogs. And oh, by the way, we got rid of a bunch of employees? Because that's the thing that I think people are missing here, is that employers on the discretionary side of the economy are not going to sit around and have idle employees standing around because they have no revenue to support them, or they have insufficient revenue. So as discretionary spending goes down, what we should see, at least particularly more on the services side and part of the manufacturing sector, is the need for employees has to go. As they lose their jobs, well, magically their discretionary spending is going to go away too. You start to create this ongoing downward spiral, as we talk about, that just gets faster and faster.
Steve, that's a big point too. Just from the Fed's regional surveys, it's not just the manufacturing, it is also the services survey. Then there's a bunch of services surveys too, and I look at 5 of those. And the Fed regional services survey, like the manufacturing survey, have said, number one, the economy has been in shallow contraction for the last couple of years. It echoes the Fed regional manufacturing surveys to a T. They're very close together. And you say, well, how can that possibly be? Because the economy's been strong and resilient. Well, what that suggests is that just what we were saying, that consumers, they were never made whole after the pandemic for that price changes. And so very slowly, very incrementally, yet steadily and persistently, the economy was eroding, it was slowing down. It was in many places actually contracting, especially in real terms when you adjust for prices. And that's what these surveys have been saying, that the economy was not strong the last couple of years. It was far weaker than people were led to believe, especially by GDP, putting up that 5% quarter in the third quarter. That was such an anomaly and aberration, but it was also incredibly misleading, as we're now seeing with the latest GDP numbers. But the point is, it's not just manufacturing, which that's easier to dismiss. That's just a small part of the economy. It's not a huge thing. We're getting it all across the economy. As we keep saying, the data is migrating in the direction of these surveys, not away from them. Now we've got GDP down at 1.3% and moving in this direction. We've got companies all over the economy saying discretionary spending, uncertain climate. We've got the Beige book referring to negligible job growth. It's not the recession that most people picture with massive amounts of layoffs, but it's everything except that.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff, because consumers really got hit 3 ways. They've seen their hours get cut. And again, as you mentioned, the services side, that was really supposed to be the huge driver of the economy. And all of a sudden, we're seeing softness there, which you and I had been warning this is likely to happen. And everyone says, no, 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 the services sector is really going to drive spending. But it didn't, and it's not supposed to. And then you start to look back and say, okay, what other factors? We've talked about gasoline prices rising and hitting consumer budgets. Again, that wasn't supposed to happen, but again, prices went up. You have to spend the money. Yes, you can cut in other areas, which is exactly what happened. And then, of course, there's the big one. Everyone woke up around the country and their auto insurers had a big smile on their face because they got a bill that says, by the way, your rates are going up. And not only just on your auto insurance, your home insurance, well, everything insurance wise, your price goes up. And now all of a sudden it's starting to really hit home in a big way. And that's a challenge here, because if we're looking for anything to say, okay, are we going to achieve the notion that there's going to be a soft landing or no landing scenario where Bostic and all the other FOMC members are going to be right and get that first rate cut maybe November or December, somewhere toward the end of the year? And the answer right now is nothing looks to be slowing this trend down. In fact, I think it's going to accelerate even faster.
Yeah, but Steve, the one thing that's going to slow that slowdown is rate cuts, right? I mean, that's what we hear. That's the next thing. You're right. You're absolutely right. If you take an honest look at the economy and see the deceleration, you start asking yourself, okay, what could stop the deceleration before it gets to the recession line that everybody agrees is a recession line? I think we're already in it to begin with, but what stops the economy from getting to that point where we are talking about mass waves of layoffs? And it's really hard to identify any factors that look like the economy is going to rebound and re-strengthen. I mean, what really is there that could do something like that? And of course, the only thing left is the mainstream idea that Jay Powell is going to start cutting rates. And so the closer we get to that point where people are getting more and more nervous about the direction of the economy, the closer the rate cuts and the rate cut rhetoric becomes, because that's the central belief that the central bank can come in with nothing more than lowering short-term interest rates, and that will cushion the blow. But the more they talk about rate cuts, the more you know that there's a blow they think that needs to be cushioned.
Yeah, I think exactly right, Jeff. I think the Fed's looking at this, and we know they talk to, each member talks to business owners in their district, and they're getting pressured, say, hey, look, things are not as great as what you guys think they are. And the timing of this as we go into the summer is really right now is where we want to see a robust services sector, because there's a lot of businesses that are very centric around summertime travel. And if they don't make their targets, they're not going to survive through the off season. And that's the danger here is, yes, you can have recessions and slowdowns, but there's certain times of the year they're better for it than others. Right now is terrible. You've seen a lot of businesses staff up. They've gotten ready for the summer boom, and they're not seeing it happen. They're already warning, hey, if this doesn't happen, I'm going to have to cut people. But this is a dangerous game, because this summer right now, a lot of business are really hoping to see their revenues jump, and it just doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Yeah, the warnings on employment and jobs we haven't seen this many since the last cycle. Really, it's become very prevalent, and for these obvious reasons, or what should be obvious reasons. And if the only offset to them is Jay Powell cutting interest rates, then you can understand the apprehension here among all the businesses that continue to report, as well as the statistics that back up their position. The economy is not strong and resilient. It looked like it for artificial reasons and transitory reasons. I'll use that term. But on the other side of all of that, we're still in the cycle. That's the message that we've been sending from the very beginning. No matter how long it has taken to get to this juncture, it has still been a cycle. And the further we go in it, it looks more like one, not less. And that's, I think, the ultimate point that we keep trying to make here and keep trying to impress is that more stuff looks like the business cycle and the downturn than is turning away and looking like a soft landing or recovery.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. And we kind of look at, the consumer behavior. Normally at this time, you see them starting to build up their savings, but everyone kind of bought into the, hey, the summer's coming. This is going to play out. And what have we seen in the buy now, pay later, or those 4-pay plans? People are already being delinquent on those payments. So you can see we were just on the edge. There was this one big push in the first quarter. Everyone kind of bought into it. And now the air is really coming out of the economy. And from my perspective, I don't think any rate cuts at this point are going to make a difference. Fed could go to 0 or minus 1,000. It wouldn't matter at all. This bottom line is the U.S. economy is slowing down. And there's nothing, I think, at this point anyone can do to stop it.
Yeah, you mentioned buy now, pay later. I mean, really alarming that the providers from buy now, pay later were saying that their customers are coming in to use those types of services for buying necessities. That's really a bad sign. And of course, Kohl's, we stopped having clearance sales, so we stopped having customers. They're all just piling up one after another. Big thanks to Mr. Stephen Van Metre, as always, for stopping by. If you want to explore why China is dumping a record amount of U.S. treasuries and what's going on there, this video I've got linked below. Thank you very much for joining me here. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members, Eurodollar University subscribers. And until next time, take care.